all religions, in my view, are stupid and dangerous.
It's ironic we're discussing this as Ben Shapiro's song Facts has been trending #1 on Apple Music because Bill Maher, a vocal atheist, recently released a clip showing how he reacts when presented with facts about the evidence for Jesus. Now, given that Bill claims that his loyalty is only to the truth,
my only loyalty always is to the truth.
Let's see how he responds when given facts about Jesus.
I believe in Jesus, by the way. We'll talk about that.
Oh.
I didn't. I went to Catholic school my whole life, but after reading this book, Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, the factual evidence that he existed is kind of overwhelming.
I'd like to see that because the factual evidence that he existed has always been underwhelming.
And we're already off to a bad start. Bill Maher claiming that the evidence for the existence of Jesus is underwhelming shows that he just isn't familiar with the evidence. Jesus' existence is a historical fact that virtually every scholar, whether religious or secular, agrees on. And in the words of the #1 rapper in the world right now, I think that Bill just needs to...
Let's look at the stats.
The truth is, we have more historical sources on Jesus than any other figure in ancient antiquity, and even Wikipedia will tell you that we have several non-Christian sources during the time that corroborate his existence, such as Tacitus, Josephus, and Pliny the Younger. It's the actual facts that prompted the most prominent atheist that's working as a New Testament scholar to say this about Bill's views.
There is a lot of evidence. I mean, there is so much evidence that it is not, I mean, I know in the crowds you all run around with, it's commonly thought that Jesus did not exist. Let me tell you, once you get outside of your conclave, there's nobody who, I mean, this is not even an issue for scholars of antiquity. There is no scholar in any college or university in the Western world who teaches classics, ancient history, New Testament, early Christianity, any related field who doubts that Jesus existed.
So if Bill wants to call the evidence for the existence of Jesus underwhelming, then that's a problem with his historical criteria, not the evidence. But wait until you hear what he says next.
If I told you, okay, if I told you factual evidence about Alexander the Great, you would believe me.
Okay, but even still, it's a silly point because who cares if Jesus lived? It's whether he's then died and was reborn and is, up in heaven with his Father who's really him. Okay. That's the part where the rubber meets the road. Maybe he existed. I agree. That's absolutely possible. He may have existed.
So, seemingly being aware that his position goes against all of the actual facts, Bill decides to concede the point that maybe Jesus existed. All right, now hold on, Ben. Don't get too excited. He grants this, but says that it's a moot point anyway because it doesn't mean that he performed miracles or was raised from the dead. Yeah, I know, buddy. Now, we'll come back to this point, but first, let's hear what else Bill says.
Chris, I'm going to have to burst your bubble now because here's I have to spit a couple of facts at you that are kind of going to under... Okay, there's only 2 sources in the Bible. Okay. There's the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Okay. There's also another guy, Josephus, who wasn't accepted, but read the Case for Christ.
Not in the Bible.
Okay.
But the Bible is itself an anthology. They found some few decades ago the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were other books that were just basically edited out. So right away we know a person decided what constituted the Bible, and just some stuff wound up on the cutting room floor.
Dude, just dude.
All right, so as you just heard, Bill retreats from saying that Jesus didn't exist into arguments that the gospel accounts of Jesus were legends that were invented several centuries after Jesus' death. But once again, even though he presents this as facts, everything that he's saying is actually in spite of the actual facts. He says that there's only 2 sources for the Bible, which he's wrong about, by the way, but he identifies those 2 sources as the gospel authors and Paul, but doesn't seem to realize that the gospel writers nor Paul are even relevant to the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Facts.
The writings of Paul and the Gospel writers were for the New Testament, but the Dead Sea Scrolls didn't even include the New Testament at all. And for context, the Dead Sea Scrolls were scrolls that were found in the Qumran caves alongside of the Dead Sea that were previously untouched for thousands of years. And contrary to Bill's claims, the scrolls in the cave only included Old Testament books, which didn't include any extra biblical books from the Old or the New Testament. Now, yes, it's true that there were some non-biblical books that were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but that's only because the Dead Sea Scrolls were an ancient library of different kinds of books and different kinds of pieces of literature. There's simply no evidence that any of the non-biblical books that were found were ever viewed as scripture. Ain't that right, Ben?
That's right. For shizzle.
So it appears that once again, Bill is claiming to appeal to facts without knowing or seemingly understanding the facts at all, leaving Ben disappointed. Now, these type of errors go on for a while, by the way. Like when he talks about how Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John weren't contemporaries of Jesus, to the Council of Nicaea having something to do with the formation of the Bible, and so on. But perhaps the most egregious and possibly the strangest of all of the facts that he got wrong is the next one, which is really bad news for Bill because once corrected, it undermines all of his arguments that he gave against Jesus for the entire podcast episode. Take a listen.
St. Paul is the other source of the Bible.
Yes.
There's Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. I said the two names out of order because that's the order in the Bible. The first gospel, Mark, is 70 AD. Jesus dies in 33. So that's 40 years almost after he died.
Okay.
So not contemporaries. Paul comes before the gospel writers. He's writing around the year 50. In the 50s.
Okay.
So he's much closer to Jesus's time. So you'd think he would know more about Jesus than the people who came later, but actually St. Paul knows almost nothing about Jesus. He barely conceives of him as something that, as a person who lived on earth. There's no details about his life like they are in the Gospels. So the people who came later know more than the person who wrote earlier. Just some food for thought.
Paul, aka Saul, knows
Yes.
that Jesus existed, right? He talks about him.
He talks about, I'm saying he conceives him as a Godhead. He doesn't have this, it's not the narrative that's in the Gospels of Jesus went around and he did miracles and he did stuff and everybody loved him and he gets quoted a lot. He makes speeches, blessed are the meek. You know, he has adventures. He goes into the desert. It's a whole thing.
But what about...
And then at the end, it's a whole drama with, you know, he's crucified. Oh, no. Paul doesn't know any of this, all the stuff that the gospel writers obsess about and that are his biography.
Okay, so first off, what's interesting about this objection is that Bill actually answered his own objection when he said that Paul doesn't mention all of the stuff that the other gospel writers obsess about in their biographies. Biographies. The gospel writers were writing biographies, not Paul. Paul wasn't trying to give a historical account of Jesus' life, but instead he was writing to the churches that needed guidance and correction. So once you understand that, then you realize that it's really kind of silly to object to Christianity by pointing out how Paul didn't give a detailed account of Jesus' life since he wasn't even trying to.
This is a meritocracy right here.
Secondly, and even worse, when Bill says that Paul didn't mention things like Jesus performed miracles or being crucified, he's wrong on that count as well. In fact, Paul talks about Christ being crucified several times in the New Testament, and even goes so far to say that he's determined to know nothing except for Jesus and him crucified. And when it comes to claims about Jesus' miracles, Paul continuously talks about Jesus' greatest miracle, which is at the heart of Christianity, the miracle of the resurrection. Paul mentions the resurrection of Jesus over a couple dozen times in the New Testament, quotes a creed in 1 Corinthians 15 and a hymn in Philippians 2 that he got from the early church which affirmed the resurrection, and goes back to just months after Jesus' death. So even if Bill were right that the gospel writers and Paul didn't write about Jesus' miracles until decades after Jesus' death, it really wouldn't matter since we know for a fact that the first Christians believed in the crucifixion and the miracle of the resurrection after Jesus' death.
Fact.
And that fact alone is enough to completely disprove Bill's entire theories of Jesus not existing and the gospel accounts of Jesus' life being legends. Now, I know that Bill doesn't particularly like the actual true facts about Jesus, but in the words of the hottest MC out right now, now, so much more could be said about all of the points that Bill brought up in that interview, but honestly, I thought that the video would be too dry and boring to respond to all of the countless other things that he got wrong in the video, so I went ahead and linked some other videos down below that cover some of the other errors that he made if you want to go ahead and learn more. But the next time you hear Ben Maher saying,
"My only loyalty always is to the truth,"
what are you gonna say? What do you mean?